So this is Dr. Parikh, and this video is for Psych Stats PS 208. And what I'm doing here today is showing you how to enter data into SPSS for doing both types of t-tests, or the main two we talk about, which is independent samples and repeated measures. So we're going to start with Chapter 10. One thing I want to do is show you some of the resources in your book. I'm using the ebook to make it easy, but the same sections are in your actual book. You can see here it walks you through how to do each piece, and when you go through the homework, it often follows pretty closely through this. And so if you go to the summary, which is the start of the sort of the colored edge pages, it shows you all the important formulas and gives you a little description of what they are. If you go back to the main chapter, to the table of contents, if you click on something, you see where it kind of walks you through and explains it a little bit, and it walks you through examples. So you can see, and there's always a section that talks about how to report it in the literature, which is important for some of the homework questions. So I just wanted to bring that up. There's also a section for each chapter that walks you through SPSS, and it walks you through what to select, how to enter things. It shows you screenshots of the output. So we spend limited time on it in class, but there's a lot of resources in your book. So I have picked a couple questions to focus on, and these are not the same as what's in your homework, but they're very similar. Now, I only have access to the ebook for the 10th edition, whereas you guys have the 9th edition of the book, but I tried to find things that you would be able to see in your edition. So here is question 7 from the 10th edition's homework. You won't see it in your homework, but if you look on page 326, this is the Sesame Street example they use for 10.1. So it says, research results suggest a relationship. They report that high school students who regularly watch Sesame Street as children had better grades in high school than their peers who did not watch Sesame Street. And so we're imagining a sample of 20 high school students. And if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down by 1, 2, 3, 4 across, you'll see there's 20 scores here. Each score represents a person. But this is chapter 10, and so these are actually matched pairs, because you'll see each sample has n equals 10, and you're using, these are not matched pairs. Each group has 10, and you see use an independent measures t-test with an alpha equals 0.01. We're not going to use an alpha of 0.01. But here's the big thing. I mentioned, like, is it matched pairs or not? This one is not. They don't talk about doing matched pairs. They just say that they found 10 kids who watched it and 10 kids who didn't. So each score represents a different person. So when we open SPSS, I'm on a Mac, so mine's going to look just a touch different, but it's going to be, the menus and everything should be almost exactly the same. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to enter one score at a time. I know this is a little time consuming, but I'm going to enter each score on a different row. The most important thing to remember about SPSS is that each row represents a person. Now sometimes we do, and I like to check, so here I'm on row 10, and I've gotten through 10 scores, so I haven't missed anything. But sometimes we'll do matched pairs where there's two people are kind of counting as one observation, but here each score is counting as a different person, and so each score gets entered on a different row. 83, 86, 81, 92, and I'm at 20. I've got 20 scores. I should be good to go. Now here's the problem. One column of data doesn't let us do anything. What we have to do here is we're comparing two different groups on one column of scores. That's the whole point of independent measures. We have two independent groups being measured once. How do I indicate that they're in different groups? I create another column. And before I finish filling that in, I'm going to go over to down here. You see I move from data view to variable view. And my first one, I'm going to delete it and I'm going to call it score. Or let's call it grades. Because I'm going to look, it's the average high school grade. Now, one thing you'll notice about this is you can't use spaces. So if I go like high school grades, I get yelled at. SPSS is a little bit, it has fairly simple programming. But if you want to use words, you can use a little underscore. So high school grades. And you got to keep your file name short for SPSS. The other one I'm going to call groups. I'm going to give them a number to designate if it's a group or not. And I'm going to give values. So 0 will be the first group, and I'm just going to go with whatever was first on the chart. So watched Sesame Street. You can use spaces here. And then I'm going to have another one, I'm going to use 1, and it's going to say, I'm just going to do no Sesame Street. You can make these whatever you want, but you want it to be something that's easy for you to remember. And so now, while I have it in my mind, I'm going to go in, and I like to sort of find the line where the groups switch over, and then fill the rest in, because I want to make sure that I'm not making a mistake. All right, so now I have my 20 scores. Each row represents a person, and I've indicated what their score was and which group they're in. So now I come over and I go to transform. Now remember, I'm on a Mac, so it's going to look a little different. Yours should be right up at the top of the window. I'm going to go to analyze. I want to go to compare means, and I have 3 different options for t-tests. I have one sample, that's chapter 9, independent samples, chapter 10, and paired samples, chapter 11. I want to use independent samples. And now you'll see I have one option for a test variable, high school grades, and I have an option for a group. Now if I enter it here, that's no good. That puts it in test variables. I need to enter it down in grouping. Now it won't let me hit OK yet because I have to define the groups. I just have to tell it what value represents different groups. Now I can hit options. I can choose what I want my confidence interval to be. I'm going to say 95%. Okay. You'll notice the output comes up in a different window here. I pull it up and I see this looks very similar to what the SPSS output in the book looks like. Here it's cut off because they printed it like a page the way it usually prints. If you were to print this, like if I go to File, Print Preview, you'll see it pulls up very similarly structured to what it looks like in your book. So your book is trying to help you if you're going to print it. But I'm going to close that out. So I look here, first I see there's 10 people in each group. They've calculated the mean high school grade score for the group that watched Sesame Street, has an average of 93. The one that didn't watch Sesame Street has an average of 85. I also have group standard deviations. That's important for when you're writing it up like you would for a literature review or to publish it in the literature. So when you have a test question like that, this is where you get standard deviation. And then this standard mean error you can kind of ignore for now. Here we're going to assume equal variances. Remember I talked about how there's certain assumptions. We're assuming that both groups have similar variances. We'll assume that. And you can kind of ignore this Levine's test right now. But we see here the t-value is 4.0 and the degrees of freedom are 18. It's not surprising here that it's 4.0, that it's a pretty number, because I got it from the test. Or I'm sorry, I got it from the book. The book tends to give you things that are easy to calculate by hand. So we see degrees of freedom is 18 because there's 10 groups and we take 1 degree of freedom away from each group. So we get degrees of freedom of 18. And we see significance is 0.001. And we have to decide, is that above or below 0.05? Well, it's below 0.05. So we get really excited because it's significant. We say this difference, I mean, obviously we see there's an 8-point difference between the groups, but we say that we can confidently say that it's unlikely that we would get a difference this big if it was all one group. And over here you see the 95% confidence interval of the actual difference. Remember, if the difference were 0, we could not reject the null hypothesis, but we see the lower is 3.798, the upper is 12.2018, and so we see that 0 falls nowhere on this line, so that again says we can reject the null hypothesis and say that there is a statistically significant finding. All right, so that is the first test. We can get rid of that, and I can open. If you want to save your file, it's again, it's sometimes a little clunky, but let me see. Actually, for some reason, mine doesn't like to keep typing. I don't know. Demo Sesame Street. So I'll save that. Now I'm going to open a new file, new data. Whew. It starts off real big. I'm going to cut it down just so that I can show you several things at once. Okay, and now I'm going to bring up the next question. So this one comes from Chapter 11. This is where we have the same participants doing multiple trials. Sometimes we also do a matched pair, where we've matched people on certain things like age, income level, score on a previous test, and then we treat them like they're one person. So anytime you have a matched pair, you should have either a participant or a matched pair number, and then 2 scores for each participant. When we go to Chapter 11, the t-test for 2 similar problems, we can go straight to SPSS and see a little bit about how to do things. And here you see things like the 2 scores for each participant must be in the same row. So remember, for participant 1, we have 2 scores. Each row represents a participant. So we're going to enter the scores. For me, I find that SPSS doesn't tend to like to go across very much. It likes to go down. I don't know if that's just my computer today or what the deal is, but I'm just going to go with it and enter it down. But I'm going to make sure that I'm entering 1 participant for each row. Oh, I mistyped. If you're not seeming to get the right answer, always go back and check to see if you might have mistyped one of your numbers. And we see this one is available actually on, this is the same as your number 24 on page 379. So you can find this in the book. It's an even, so you won't get the answers in the book. But you can find this same problem, even though it's a different number from what it is in the 10th edition. Let's see. And this one is about participants putting their hands in icy water, and sometimes they were asked to just repeat a neutral word. Other times they were asked to repeat their favorite swear word, and we looked to see how long they could hold their hands in very cold, like really icy cold water. So it's meant to be something that's painful but not actually harmful, the idea that people wouldn't hold their hands in the water long enough to hurt them. And so it's 1 person, 2 different measurements. You see how this is repeated measurements. And in one trial, we had swear words, and the other trial we had neutral words. So we'd consider the swear words to be the treatment. This is the independent variable. And then the dependent variable is how long they were keeping it in. Usually the scores that we're calculating are the dependent variable. So now I need to go to variable view, and I need to name my variables. So the first one, I look at what the first column was, and it's swear words. Oh, but I can't use a space. And the other one is neutral words. Okay, and I don't need values for these because neither of the, they're just kind of scores. It's not like 1 means men and 2 means women or anything like that. So I look here, I don't have any groups, which is okay because I don't have any groups here. Instead, I have 2 measurement points for each person. I know that I'm being really repetitive, but it's because it's that tough to keep this stuff straight. So I go to analyze, compare means, because I'm comparing means, and I look at my three options and I choose paired samples t-test. Now you'll notice this box looks a little different than the last box. Instead, I'm choosing two variables that I'm going to compare. Now I could hit OK now. I'm going to hit options again. I can change the confidence interval if I want to. And now I hit OK. And I come up with a second set of output. And this one looks pretty similar to the first one. Looking at the output alone, it's not as, you can see some differences, because here it's high school grades and it shows two different groups. Here it shows that it's pairs and then it's two different measurements. So we look here, we look at the SPSS data in the book, and it looks really similar. So we see 10 people in each group. We see standard deviations for each group. We see a correlation and a significance for that. That's different than what we saw the last time. Last time there were only 2 rows. And then down here you see the mean difference is 14. There's a standard deviation for the difference. And you also see a standard error. Standard error of the mean, actually, and then you see the 95% confidence interval, 5.9 and 22. Once again, we see that 0 isn't anywhere on here, so we expect that it should be a significant finding. We look at our t-value, 3.913. Now you could look up your critical value in the book. You could just look up at the critical value for, you know, the two-sided point or two-tailed 0.05 with a degrees of freedom of 9, because we have 10 participants. So 9 degrees of freedom. But here it tells you the significance is 0.004. So it's just two different ways of seeing if it's valid. One way is, or significant. One way is you look up the critical value of t and see if this is beyond the critical value. The other way is SPSS will give you the significance, the exact significance, and then we just look, is it smaller than 0.05? And here it's 0.004, so it is smaller, so it is a significant finding. We can reject the null hypothesis. So let me, again, I'm going to just save this real quick. It's always a good idea to save it. So I'm going to say, instead of Sesame Street, I'm going to call it swear words, two very different things. So this should be, if you follow the same steps for your homework problems, you should be able to put together SPSS files. Again, the key thing to remember, one participant, one line. You either have 2 measurements or you have a measurement and a group membership. Just depends which kind it is. And if you go into your book, it walks you through the steps. Thanks.